Dear friends, so far I've released 5 videos dedicated to the construction of the Egyptian pyramids. In them, I've tried not only to draw your attention to the various interesting details of these ancient structures, but also to provide a rational explanation for them. Because in my opinion, all these details and nuances are important clues that can help us understand the logic of the ancient Egyptian builders. At the same time, I believe that many researchers repeatedly make a very serious methodological error. They assume that the pyramid's strange internal structure and its elements can be explained in terms of symbolism or the religious beliefs of the ancient Egyptians. After all, once you allow yourself to attribute everything to religion and cults, you lose the opportunity to understand the true meaning of all these very unusual architectural solutions we see inside and outside the pyramids. And in this video, I'll show you how much we can understand if we temporarily remove all these religious and symbolic meanings from our considerations. If we choose the rationality of the ancient builders as the starting point for our reasoning, this is very important because I am convinced that there could only be one logic that would have allowed all these enormous structures to be built. This is rational logic, based on centuries of experience, pragmatism, and the outstanding skill of the ancient builders. And stories about the flight of the pharaoh's soul to the stars have nothing to do with this logic. But if this is true, then what is the real reason for this strange internal layout of the Egyptian pyramids, the likes of which you will find nowhere else? What motivated the ancient architects when they created such incomprehensible structures? What was the secret of the ancient builders that allowed them to go from the first step pyramid to the Great Pyramid of Khufu in just 100 years? I believe I know the right answer, and it's a perfectly rational one. It's the method of lifting blocks. It's this method that made the pyramids what we know them as, and it's the reason for most of the strange regularities we observe in their internal structure. And what is very important, this can be proven. Because, unlike the illusory world of religious meanings and elusive interpretations, we have precise measurements, formal logic, physics, and mathematics at our disposal. As I mentioned in this video, there are many details inside and outside the pyramids that indicate their builders used the same basic principle for lifting building materials. Blocks were raised by lowering a counterweight. Moreover, what is very important is that people acted as this counterweight, since people are the only counterweight that can quickly rise back up on its own. It's a very simple and yet highly productive method, and to use it, you need 2 things: a large enough space for the platform to descend vertically and a ramp or staircase for people to climb back up. And those who have had even the slightest interest in the Egyptian pyramids will immediately see something very familiar in this diagram. Indeed, this idea instantly provides a rational explanation for all those enormous pits we see on the sites of unfinished and dismantled pyramids. I'm sure these pits weren't created for religious reasons or simply to construct burial chambers. They played a vital role in the pyramid construction process. Platforms with counterweights were lowered into them, and the people who acted as this counterweight then walked up the ramp. We will not now dwell on the technical aspects of this method, which, incidentally, is still used in industrial mountaineering. This is a topic for a separate, serious discussion. However, I'd like to immediately highlight 2 of its main advantages. Firstly, it allows for a constant force to be applied throughout the entire lift, unlike any manual push-pull method, which is extremely important in terms of wear and tear on the ropes, of which a huge number were required. Second, this method allows for much greater load movement speeds than a manual winch. After all, lifting speed was critical for the construction of the Great Pyramids, which required moving millions of tons of blocks upward. And this video will be the first in a series of videos in which we will explore in detail how this method was used by ancient builders, how it developed as the pyramids grew in size, and why it essentially determined the entire configuration of their internal structure. But first, it is very important for us to understand how this block lifting technology came about and how widely it was used by builders to solve various problems. You'll see now that this method will help us explain much not only inside the pyramids, but also around them, and that objects familiar to everyone from school may actually have a meaning quite different from what's commonly attributed to them. Saqqara, the famous pyramid of Djoser, designed by the great Imhotep. This step pyramid is the first of the Egyptian pyramids. Beneath it, there is a huge shaft almost 30 meters deep, and the purpose of this shaft has long been a subject of debate among many renowned Egyptologists. The main question, of course, is why was it left empty instead of filled with blocks? We see nothing similar in the subsequent pyramids. There's even a theory that it was cleared out many centuries after the pyramid's construction, which seems extremely unlikely to me given the volume of the shaft, which is several thousand cubic meters, and the main staircase is completely blocked. Furthermore, researchers are completely baffled as to why the pyramid's creators didn't leave a layer of rock above the shaft, as shown in Keith Hamilton's drawing. This would have been much simpler in terms of the stability of the entire structure above. Instead, the shaft extended upward and passed through the central superstructure, as seen in this diagram. And it's very important that the proposed version of the block lifting process, in which a platform carrying people is used as a counterweight, may provide answers to all these questions. This shaft does not yet have the classic form of the pits created for pyramids during the 4th Dynasty, but all the necessary attributes are present: a large, deep space for lowering platforms carrying people and an inclined staircase leading from the shaft to the base of the pyramid. Workers could use this staircase to ascend back to the surface, thus repeating this cycle of descent and ascent again and again. In the future, the place of such a staircase will be taken by inclined corridors, which will become a true calling card of the Great Pyramids. Instead of a shaft, pits with inclined ramps will be created, along which these corridors will be laid. And we will certainly analyze in detail this development, which began with the construction of the first pyramid. But first, we need to understand the origins of this technology. We need to trace its use not only after the Djoser pyramid, but also before it. Because such a method of lifting blocks could not have arisen suddenly, but had to develop gradually over a long period of time. In the book by the English archaeologist John Garstang, Tombs of the Third Egyptian Dynasty, the author very clearly shows the evolution of ancient Egyptian tombs and their stair sections. You'll agree that all these diagrams clearly parallel the system created beneath the pyramid of Djoser. Everywhere there is space for a vertical descent of a platform with people and an inclined passage back to the surface. Tombs in ancient Egypt were built over many centuries, both before and after the pyramid of Djoser. The technology of their construction gradually changed. Their sizes and the materials from which they were made changed. The location of the burial chamber also changed, but the only thing that remained constant was the presence of a vertical descent from the highest point of the mastaba downwards. The configuration of the internal structure itself, however, could vary greatly. The vertical descent could lead directly into the burial chamber. Later, the burial chamber began to be created in a separate room, carved into bedrock or solid ground. But the vertical descent remained. The staircase's configuration varied. It could be very complex, with several turns, but the vertical shaft was always present. And in the large mastabas of the Third Dynasty, there could be 3 or even 5 of these shafts. And note that they always passed through the above-ground part of the tomb and did not end at ground level, just like the central shaft in Djoser's pyramid. And when, at the turn of the 3rd and 4th dynasties, The inclined passages with stairs in the tombs disappeared. These vertical shafts remained. And John Garstang writes of them as follows: the shaft leading directly down to the bottom of the passage, which seems always to have been found indispensable. That is, he understood that it served some important function, since it was an obligatory attribute of all tombs without exception, but he didn't quite understand what it was. In general, such shafts with a square or nearly square cross-section are a true calling card of ancient Egypt. Their total number is measured in the thousands, and as we will soon see, the ancient Egyptians' love for them was most likely not limited to funerary traditions. In addition, it's important to pay attention to inclined staircases. Let's take as an example the huge tomb of King Neterket in the area of Beit Khallâf, also known as Mastaba K1. Its base measures 85 by 45 meters, and its height is approximately 10 meters. Why was this narrow, inclined staircase needed here at all, first passing through the mud brick masonry and then descending another 15 meters below the surface? It's believed the body was carried along it during burial. But wouldn't it have been simpler to lower it into the central vertical shaft and avoid the need for any staircases, as was done a little later during the Fourth Dynasty? John Garstang writes, the primary motive for this remarkable design was the safety of the burial chamber. This suggests that all these vertical shafts served as security features, as we see locking stones at the bottom of each one. It turns out that the builders first created a long staircase, which supposedly posed a huge safety problem, and then heroically overcame this problem by creating as many as 5 vertical shafts. And this, instead of creating a single vertical shaft without any staircase, thus eliminating any security issues. Something clearly doesn't add up with this explanation. Some of you may think that lowering something into a deep shaft might not have been very convenient for the creators of these tombs. I assure you, this is not the case. Firstly, very soon, at the turn of the Third and Fourth Dynasties, the staircases in the mastabas would disappear, leaving only these vertical shafts. Secondly, after construction was completed, they would lower stones like these, weighing from 3 to 6 tons, and sometimes even more than 10 tons. So lowering a body into them for burial would have been no problem at all. Moreover, in Mastaba K1, the ground there was quite hard, and it was relatively easy to create a staircase by digging a tunnel. In other tombs, it was necessary to dig a pit, build additional internal brick walls to prevent the soil from collapsing inward, and cover the staircase with an arched vault. Here's an example of tomb R40. Most of the stairway ceilings have collapsed, allowing us to estimate the volume of the excavated pit. Here's tomb R1, even larger than R40. Here you can clearly see the vertical shafts that pass through the above-ground part. Can you imagine the volume of this work? First, dig a trench, then fill it with bricks, creating a tunnel underneath. And all this just to carry a body through at once? It certainly wouldn't have been worth building such a massive structure. You might counter this by saying that such a staircase could have been used to excavate the burial chamber itself. But the point is that the volume of earth removed to create this staircase is several times greater than the volume of the main chambers, which makes such an assumption clearly illogical. Therefore, I believe that the presence of such a structure can only mean one thing. This staircase was actively used by builders after construction of the above-ground part of the tomb began. Moreover, look at the condition of the staircase itself. It doesn't look like it was used to carry the body of the deceased only once. The level of wear on the steps clearly indicates that a large number of people have passed through here. And the idea that these vertical shafts and staircases were used to lift building material explains it all. If this idea is correct, then these staircases were needed so that workers who had descended the shaft could climb back up to the surface. And, accordingly, it's understandable why they were so securely constructed and reinforced. After all, thousands of people used them to ascend. At the same time, using such a simple method was extremely rational. If you're already digging a hole in the ground, why not put it to good use? The gravel and mud bricks used as building material for these mastabas certainly weren't multi-ton blocks, but their combined weight wasn't much less. The total weight of the building material for the K1 mastaba in Beit Khallâf is estimated at tens of thousands of tons, and hauling it all up by hand would clearly have been no easy task. But after the mastaba was built, these shafts could indeed have been used as a means of protection against robbers by lowering locking stones down and covering them with gravel on top. So in my opinion, this defensive version of the shaft's purpose, currently generally accepted among Egyptologists and described in great detail in Reg Clark's book Securing Eternity, is partly correct, but it doesn't truly reflect their primary function. But here you can rightly object, saying that perhaps this all sounds logical, but it can only be indirect confirmation, but not direct proof of the hypothesis in question. And that something much more substantial is needed to confirm this hypothesis. I completely agree with you. So I spent a considerable amount of time trying to figure out what such proof could be. And as often happens in such cases, it turned out that the simplest and most obvious answer was right there in plain sight all along. And perhaps that's precisely why no one noticed it. Let's imagine for a moment that the idea I've proposed is correct, and people actually descended these shafts as counterweights. Then, how would the load being lifted have moved? Purely theoretically, it's possible to imagine such a scenario. But then we'd have to build an additional ramp and use excessively long ropes. And a huge number of such ropes would have been required. So taking all this into account, what would the optimal design have looked like? Like this. These mastabas were built using thick brick walls built around the perimeter, with gravel and sand poured inside. It's logical to assume that some part of the wall could have been missing, and a sand ramp leading from below to the shaft. Fine. And we're looking at the final stage of construction. But what should have been at the beginning? And at the beginning of the creation of the above-ground part of the tomb in this version, the inclined ramp went almost horizontally from the edge of the mastaba. That is, the distance from the edge of the mastaba to the shaft should have been equal to the depth of the shaft's underground section. If this is true, then as we increase the building level, we will always have enough shaft depth to lift the load. Now let's look at mastaba K1. The same color indicates sections of equal length. You must admit this is a very strange coincidence. If these shafts were only for safety, then why does the depth of the central shaft match the distance to the edge of the mastaba? Let's look at other tombs. This is mastaba K2 in the same Beit Khallâf, mastaba K3 and K4, mastaba K5, the so-called Covington's tomb on the Giza plateau, tomb 3050 in Saqqara, tomb 287 in Helwan, tomb 33 in Abu Sir, tomb 9 in the tomb of Necher-Oparef in Djoser. Moreover, apparently, a similar method was used since the time of the First Dynasty. Here are the tombs in Saqqara from that period. Despite the completely different design, the principle of equal shaft depth and distance to the edge is observed. Now let's move on to the Giza plateau. Next to the Khufu pyramid is the necropolis. This is its eastern part. The mastabas here are mostly double and arranged in even rows. The width of most mastabas is standard, about 20 meters. What do you think the depth of the shafts is? That's right, from 8 to 10 meters. And this list can go on and on. Sometimes the shaft's depth is greater than the distance to the edge. This could be explained by the ramp extending not toward the near side, but toward the opposite one. Or perhaps it originally extended beyond the perimeter. But the main thing is that of the dozens of tombs whose plans I was able to examine, I haven't found a single one in which the shaft's depth was significantly less than the distance to the edge, which can't possibly be a coincidence. I don't know if the facts presented here can be considered absolute proof of the hypothesis put forward, but I now have no doubt that these shafts were directly related to the construction process. I believe that the correlation between the shaft's depth and their distance from the edge of the mastaba cannot be explained otherwise. Now let's consider another aspect. Most mastabas at the Giza necropolis have not one shaft on each side, but two. The second shaft is often significantly shallower. Furthermore, while the main shaft always has a burial space at the bottom, the smaller shafts either lack this space or have only a very small one. How can this be explained? I think when people were descending into the deep main shaft as a counterweight, they had to first get off the platform so that it could rise up. Then, presumably, a ladder was lowered down so they could ascend themselves. And since this shaft was used to lift building materials, such an operation would have required at least several people. Consequently, there had to be ample space below. The second shaft, however, helped move the lifted load. This could likely be accomplished with just one worker, and a large niche below wasn't required. Furthermore, this method had one natural limitation. It wasn't possible to stop the iteration halfway. Once you boarded this platform, you had to ride it to the final stop, as there was nowhere to exit midway through the shaft. This didn't pose any problems when lifting the load, as the shaft's current depth was always equal to the ramp's length. But it was necessary to move it further at different distances, and presumably this made it easier to move the load in several steps, but still get it to the desired destination. Therefore, the second shaft's depth is much shallower. Let's return to the stairway tombs. The same logic applies to them. It immediately becomes clear why a central shaft was always necessary and why it was usually larger than all the others. After all, it was used for lifting loads. But here's what's interesting. In Mastaba K1, there are two central shafts, and they are located very close to each other. The second shaft, of course, could also have been used for lifting, just like the first. But I think their placement is not solely related to this. Together, they could have lifted the rock left over from excavating the burial chambers. I believe it was this technique that allowed the builders to create a very extensive system of chambers in these tombs. And after the staircases disappeared, leaving only a single shaft without additional ones, even in the large mastabas of Giza, the volume of the interior spaces was sharply reduced. You might think, then, that the earth could have been lifted up not through the shaft, but through the staircase itself. But I think this would be incorrect, because to organize the lifting of anything up these stairs to the surface, constant two-way traffic is required. People have to ascend and descend, and these staircases are very narrow, just like the inclined corridors in the pyramids. It's impossible to ascend and descend them simultaneously. They were clearly designed for one-way traffic. Now let's look at the side shafts. I think these shafts were needed to move building materials. There's an interesting nuance here too. Note the large distance between the second and third shafts. If it were any smaller, the counterweight platform simply wouldn't reach the bottom of the shaft when moving the load. Consequently, the system wouldn't work. That's why the distance between the shafts was chosen to be equal to the full depth of the third shaft. This made it possible to move the load at all stages of construction of the above-ground part of the tomb. In addition, on the other side of the stairs, there were often shallower shafts. It is believed that they were specifically created above the burial chambers and intended for offerings to the deceased. And I won't even dispute this. However, I believe that during the construction of the mastaba, they also helped move building materials, but in a different direction from the central shafts. Again, an interesting detail can be noted here. The The maximum length of ropes used during the construction of the mastaba was apparently equal to the full depth of the central shaft. These smaller shafts were positioned precisely this distance, allowing for the maximum movement of loads toward the edge. In addition to all of the above, the hypothesis under consideration allows us to answer two more fundamental questions that have long been debated by experts. The first question: why are vertical shafts almost never located in the center of mastabas? Egyptologists, of course, attribute this to security measures. Supposedly, the builders hid them from potential robbers. I'm no expert, of course, but in my opinion, Egyptologists have greatly overestimated the issue of burial security in ancient Egypt. The security factor has simply become another convenient, universal explanation for any unclear details. And as we've already seen, this strange placement of the shafts is actually explained by entirely different reasons. The second question: why are mastabas always rectangular and not square? The answer to this, as you already understood, also lies in the technological plane. This shape simply followed from the methods of their construction. More precisely, from the logistics of raising the building materials. Of course, this is only a superficial analysis. The total number of mastabas is simply enormous. Understanding all the details would require considerable time. But I believe you get the basic idea. And I hope you'll agree with me that there are very compelling arguments that this method of raising building materials was used in the construction of all or almost all of the tombs listed. At the same time, these staircase tombs of the Third Dynasty are especially important to us now. Since these mastabas were the immediate predecessors of Djoser's pyramid, we can assume that pyramid design and construction methods emerged and developed during their construction. Furthermore, there is no doubt that the internal structure of these tombs, with their inclined staircase, served as a prototype not only for the first pyramid, but also for subsequent pyramids. In all of them, we see similar long descending staircases and corridors. And what's very characteristic is that, just as in the tombs, more time and effort was obviously spent on creating these staircases and corridors in the pyramids than on constructing the chambers themselves. This suggests that their role was unlikely to be limited to a one-time participation in the funerary ritual. Finally, let's return to the shaft beneath Djoser's pyramid. Above it, we also see a mastaba. In this projection, it's offset relative to the shaft, but if you look in the north-south direction, the mastaba is located almost symmetrically relative to the shaft, and we can verify the rule we just discovered. As you can see, it works perfectly in Djoser's pyramid as well. This tells us that the same construction methods and design techniques were used in its construction as in the tombs, and this is very important. In the previous video, I showed how the designs of all the first pyramids are connected. And as you've probably already realized, I'm certain that the reason for this connection is precisely the method of lifting the blocks used in their construction. Now, we've seen that this connecting thread doesn't begin with the first pyramid, but extends back to the earliest dynasties of ancient Egypt. I wouldn't like to sum things up now. Let us leave the main conclusions until the end of the next part, in which we will examine in detail the shaft of the Djoser pyramid and understand how the principle discussed was applied in the first pyramid and developed further. But in the end, I would like to draw your attention to one point that I think is very important. Many films and books talk about the ancient Egyptians' architectural and construction genius, which allowed them to build all those enormous pyramids. But what lies behind these generalities? What exactly was this genius? How did their approach to construction differ from everyone else's? I believe it is because the internal structure of their buildings always had a dual purpose, and this is truly a brilliant solution. On the one hand, all those shafts, staircases, chambers, and corridors could have been used for religious and ritual purposes after the pyramids were built. And this is what is familiar to us. So, It's logical that this is precisely what Egyptologists focus on. But on the other hand, these elements were used as construction tools during the pyramid construction process. That's why they have such a strange layout, and that's why so many people see technological meaning in them. And they're right, only this is not the technology of a space lighthouse or a power station of ancient aliens, but a construction technology. Dear friends, write in the comments what you think about the ideas presented in this video. And of course, if you liked the video, click the like button and subscribe to the channel. You can also support my channel financially. The link is in the description of this video. Thank you very much for your time and attention.